All right, let's dive right in. At the very heart of our democracy, a really serious allegation has been made. A new forensic analysis of Texas's latest congressional maps is claiming they weren't just redrawn, they were actually engineered with a specific formula to water down the voting power of Hispanic communities. Now, the people who wrote this analysis, they do not pull any punches. They call it a, quote, calculated racial strategy. That phrase alone, it just elevates this way beyond normal political gamesmanship. It raises some really fundamental questions about fairness and representation in our elections. Okay, so you hear an explosive allegation like that, and you gotta ask, where's the evidence? So for the next few minutes, we're gonna do just that. We're gonna follow the data trail that this report lays out step by step to see exactly how the analysts built their case. To really get what they're arguing, we have to start with the data. So let's follow the numbers. So the key metric here, the one this entire analysis is built on, is something called SSVR. That stands for Spanish Surname Voter Registration. It's essentially a proxy, an estimate that analysts use to figure out the share of Hispanic voters in any given district. This one metric, it's the foundation for everything that follows. Now, take a look at this table, specifically that column labeled Delta SVR. That little triangle, the delta symbol, it just means change. And you'll notice in every single district that this report flags, that change is negative. Across the board, the share of Hispanic voters went down. And to really put a fine point on it, just look at Congressional District 27. It saw its Hispanic voter share drop by a full percentage point. That was the single biggest drop they identified. But according to this analysis, these numbers aren't just random fluctuations. They're part of a much bigger pattern. So what are these patterns? Well, the analysis says it found 3 interlocking tactics that were allegedly used to systematically and purposefully weaken the Hispanic vote. The first pattern they point to is what they call the replacement population. The idea is that when the share of Hispanic voters went down, it was consistently replaced by non-Hispanic Anglo voters. The report is really clear on this. It describes this not as just some random demographic shift, but as a deliberate one-way swap. Okay, the second pattern is all about location, location, location. The report makes a point to say that these drops didn't just happen anywhere in the state. No, they were concentrated in really politically sensitive areas. Places like South Texas and the Houston suburbs, which happen to be the exact places where Hispanic voters form a huge and influential voting bloc. Now, this third pattern, it's a bit more subtle, but it's absolutely crucial. They call it the turnout effect. What the analysis found was that these districts didn't just lose Hispanic voters, their overall turnout rates also fell. The allegation here is that low turnout Hispanic areas were specifically swapped for higher turnout Anglo and Asian areas, which would multiply the impact on actual election results. So let's recap. You've got demographic replacement, you have strategic locations, and you have this turnout effect, all pushing in the exact same direction. The report puts these 3 things together and basically asks the central question here. Is this all just one massive coincidence, or is it by design? This slide really gets to the core of the whole argument. I mean, look at the 2 columns. In a truly race-neutral process, you would expect to see some random changes, right? But what the analysis claims it found was a consistent, one-way drop in the Hispanic vote, which was then replaced by very specific groups, amplified by turnout, and carried out with what they call targeted precision. And all of that leads us right to the analysts' final conclusion. So let's trace the exact path they took to get there. Here's their logic, laid out for us. First, they observed the raw data, those consistent drops in SSVR. Second, they identified those 3 interlocking patterns we just talked about. Third, they did a probability assessment. They asked, what are the odds? And concluded that these patterns lining up so perfectly was just statistically unlikely to be a coincidence. And that's what leads to their final inference, that diminishing Hispanic voting strength was, to use their own words, a primary factor in how these districts were designed. So all of this leaves us with a really fundamental question. This analysis, it presents one interpretation of the data, but the issue underneath it all is much, much bigger. In an age where our technology can draw political lines with almost surgical precision, who gets to decide what's fair?